Welcome to the inaugural public event of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute at the University of Michigan. I'm Lori McCauley, Provost and Executive Vice President for Academic Affairs, and I'm just so happy to welcome you. I've been so looking forward to this event, and it's in my favorite space on our entire campus. So I can tell it's going to be a really special evening, and I really appreciate all of you joining us. Anytime we as a university embark on a new journey, especially in partnership with our alumni and community, it's a time to celebrate. And tonight we have much to celebrate. We're here to mark the genesis of a grand new project. But even as I'm excited to be here and welcome you all to tonight's panel, I know it's also a solemn time. We're speaking as if under a long shadow, because the ideas and problems of the Wallenberg Institute, the ones that they will tackle, are very old. In fact, these worst of human impulses seem to be endemic to society. The breadth of people here tonight from across the world bears this out. Religious and ethnic hatreds are pervasive, persistent, and when left unchecked, have catastrophic consequences. We're here tonight in part to recognize that civilization requires continuous maintenance. That kind of civilizational maintenance is at the heart of the Wallenberg Institute's mission to foster the values embodied by Raoul Wallenberg himself: empathy, courage, and leadership. The Institute stands poised to study and promote the values that underpin not only our campuses, but those of just and harmonious societies in general: tolerance, cross-cultural understanding, and a dedication to civic discourse. I believe that in order to celebrate the momentum and community inherent in this incredible moment, it's appropriate to reflect on what is at stake in the current moment when old hatreds are finding new audiences. To say there's a rise in anti-Semitism and religious intolerance is a generalization, but the effects of this societal malady are not. The way we experience hatred is personal. It poisons everything it touches. Most of us know someone who's been the target of hatred or discrimination. It can produce loneliness, fear, and even death. As so many of you in the audience know, these are not abstractions. Religious and ethnic hatred and the pernicious tropes it creates can mean broken windows, sleepless nights, death threats, and so much worse. And now we're living in an era when the internet catalyzes these resentments. Anti-Semitic cliches that are centuries old are finding new footing amongst people who in many cases have never met a Jewish person in their lives. The same is true for other people of Middle Eastern descent. This is a great season for people who fear the other. And when real flesh and blood people are reduced to digital avatars and anonymous commoners, it makes dehumanization all the more insidious. But despite all that, this evening is not about the despair that one might feel as a natural reaction to this situation. It's about despair's archenemy, magnified by the power of community. It's about hope, and it's about a very specific kind: hope born through action. Above all, that is what distinguished Raoul Wallenberg. He refused despair and instead let a vision of hope guide him to action. It's the reason we have a sculpture in his honor outside the Art and Architecture building with an inscription that is profound and miraculous. One person can make a difference. That conviction distinguishes many of our most revered figures. It is also the foundational principle behind the Wallenberg Institute. And amazingly, it is that profound truth that rallies and inspires us to see what we can accomplish together. This power of one person to affect change has left us surrounded by gifts tonight. Gifts of time, of funding, of labor and planning, and in some cases, of wisdom earned through the most difficult experiences a human could ever endure. We are so grateful for those gifts. I would like to thank Dr. Irene Butter, Professor Emerita from the University of Michigan School of Public Health, for being with us this evening. Among her great many accomplishments, Dr. Butter co-founded the Raoul Wallenberg Medal and Lecture Series in 1990. I would also like to thank our other panelists, Professors Matthew Countryman and Elliot Ratzman, and Newman Civic Fellow Soo-Young Christina Kim, all of whom will be introduced shortly. I would especially like to thank Jeff Weidlinger, the Joseph Brodsky Collegiate Professor of History and Judaic Studies and our inaugural director of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. Jeff's vision has been integral to the effort that led us here. He's a wonderful scholar, a great partner in this work, and a great neighbor as I run into him walking his dog and we have fruitful conversations in our neighborhood. Thank you, Jeff. Also deserving of our gratitude are the many guests who have supported this institute and other crucial projects at the university, and in some cases, traveled from across the nation. Arn Tellem, Alicia and Ron Cipriano, Debbie and Ken Kaplan, Debbie Wasserman and Jason Glasser, Seth and Julie Boxer, Hillary and Andrew Beckman, John Harris, Patty Kenner, Brian and Jennifer Hermelin. Thank you for those of you who are with us this evening. Many of you from far away, thank you so much for your support. Rabbi Eli Merrifield from the Zeckelman Holocaust Center in Farmington Hills, thank you for being here tonight. And in particular, our regents who are with us tonight, Paul Brown and Sarah Hubbard, thank you for representing the board and for the board's support, really igniting this work and supporting the institution of this institute. To all of you attending tonight, your presence and the power and community it brings means so much to all of us invested in the Wallenberg Institute. It's now my pleasure to introduce Dr. Rosie Ceballo, Dean of the College of Literature, Science, and the Arts, and Professor in the Department of Psychology and the Department of Women's and Gender Studies. Professor Ceballo is a distinguished scholar, and her time at Michigan is long and deep, having previously been here for over 30 years, first as a graduate student and then joining the faculty, serving as a department chair, associate dean in LS&A, before leaving us for a position as dean at Georgetown, and then our good fortune to recruit her back this year as a dean of LS&A. Welcome, Dean Ceballo.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, Provost Macaulay. And thank you, I'm just going to do, Provost Macaulay did all the necessary thanks, and I hope I'm not touching anything I shouldn't be for the images. I am just going to thank everyone again for being here because it is so cold, right? I think the fact that we're all here is just, we all deserve like a special, I don't know, a special something to brave the elements to be here. So I also have a special personal thanks that I'm going to do. I'm going to thank Jeff personally, because usually I say to my spouse, I can't see you tonight, I'll be home late, I have an event. And Jeff actually invited me and my spouse to this event. So we're actually both here together, and that was lovely for our family. So, as Dean of LSA, I'm not only delighted to join you for this incredibly important event of the Wallenberg Institute, I'm also immensely proud that the Raoul Wallenberg Institute is housed within LSA. The mission of the Wallenberg Institute is three-pronged. First, to study hatred against religious and ethnic communities. Second, to promote cross-cultural understanding. And third, to elevate civic discourse through teaching, research, and public engagement, thereby combating anti-Semitism, divisiveness, and discrimination. I'm going to assert that those goals are precisely what we should be doing in a liberal arts college like LSA. In LSA, our mission dovetails beautifully with these goals. We strive to educate students by teaching them to tackle problems from different perspectives, to learn how to think about cultures and languages and beliefs and experiences that are different from their own with openness, not fear, and not judgment. As one of the nation's preeminent public universities, we are committed to supporting and equipping future leaders with knowledge, skills, and the empathy that they will need to challenge all the forms of hatred and discrimination that they will face. And we can't underestimate the importance of these skills and these goals at this time in our history. The Raoul Wallenberg Institute will play an incredibly special role in those goals. When I was a graduate student here at the University of Michigan many, many moons ago, thank you, Provost, for not saying how long ago, one of the first things that I was taught is the importance of asking the right questions. Your work can only be as interesting or as challenging as the questions that you ask, my mentors taught me. And tonight it is clear that the Wallenberg Institute will lead us as a community in tackling many of those hard questions together. Tonight's event asks the question, can one person make a difference? And if so, how? This seemingly straightforward question is loaded with possible meanings, nuance, and inspires a host of sub-questions which led my partner and I to immediately disagree with each other. As we talked about this evening, can one person make a difference alone? Can one person make a difference for how many others? Who gets to judge the difference and the impact? The how here is really important. Are all the ways of making a difference equally valuable? What if others are harmed in the process? Can our historical heroes and heroines like Martin Luther King inspire us to make a difference? Or can we become paralyzed by their singular examples of bravery and courage? Do humans need a kernel of hope, as Viktor Frankl proposed during his time in a concentration camp? Do we need a kernel of hope simply to survive, let alone make a difference? I'm deeply excited by the vision and the many important questions and dialogues that the inaugural director of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute will lead for us. And I have the honor of introducing him, Professor Jeffrey Weidlinger. He is, as you've heard, the Joseph Brodsky Collegiate Professor of History and Judaic Studies. He is an award-winning author whose latest book, entitled In the Midst of Civilized Europe, The Pogroms of 1918 to 1921 and the Onset of the Holocaust, won numerous awards. I was given a limited amount of time, so I'm not going to tell you what all of them were. One of the highlights of my fall semester was visiting Professor Weidlinger's class, the Holocaust history class. He taught in one of our innovative 360 classrooms where students surrounded him. And I was lucky enough to hear him lecture on Raoul Wallenberg's life and to see the videos and the images that he projected for his students. He's a passionate teacher and instructor who inspires our students. I've also been honored to work with Jeff as a dean since I began in this role. No surprise, it is not easy to launch a new institute at any university, under any conditions. And I have greatly admired Jeff's calm and patient approach to problems and challenges, his deep integrity, and above all, his willingness, and this is really important, his willingness not just to listen, but to seek out people who may disagree with him and to seek dialogue with them. There is no doubt in my mind that we are incredibly lucky to have Professor Weidlinger as the inaugural director of the Raoul Wallenberg Institute. Please join me in warmly welcoming him.
There we go. All right, thank you very much. Thank you so much, Provost Macaulay and Dean Ceballo. Really appreciate those kind words. And thank you both for being here and for the support that you have given to the Raoul Wallenberg Institute since its foundation only a few months ago. Seems like it's been a lot longer than that, but it hasn't. Thank you also to all of you for joining us this evening, faculty, fellows, alumni, regents, visitors, and particularly the students, including those of you who are enrolled in the Wallenberg Institute course on civic and ethnic, or on religious and ethnic tolerance. I want to give a special thank you to the Wallenberg Institute Steering Committee, which laid out a vision for the Institute in its infancy, and to the Executive Committee, which is helping implement that vision. And most importantly, I want to thank our staff, Miriam Mora and Joe Johnson, who's somewhere, maybe outside right now, who've been working tirelessly with us to establish this Institute from the ground up, to welcome our fellows, to carry out our research, and to stage public programs like the one we're doing tonight. So thank you to them, first of all. Thank you. Now, it's an honor and privilege for me to be serving as the Institute's inaugural director. This institute is named in honor of Raoul Wallenberg, a Michigan graduate from the class of 1935 who led the most successful rescue operation of Jews during the Holocaust and saved the lives of thousands of Hungarian Jews by issuing protective passports and sheltering families from deportation in safe houses he established throughout Budapest. This institute will study hatred directed against religious and ethnic communities, foster cross-cultural understanding, and elevate civic discourse through teaching, research, and public engagement by developing strategies to combat anti-Semitism, divisiveness, and discrimination. This mission is very personal to me, not only as a scholar of the Holocaust, but also as the son of a Hungarian Jewish survivor from Budapest. And that's the photo that you've all gotten a preview of, which is actually my father in 1944 outside his apartment, on the balcony of his apartment, together with my grandmother, grandfather, and great-grandmother. It may look like a happy moment, and indeed it may actually have been a happy moment for them. But the yellow stars that they are all wearing on their outfits reminds us that this was a time of hatred and discrimination. It's a photo taken shortly before the whole family was ordered to leave their apartment and lined up on the street to be deported to Auschwitz simply because they were Jewish. Although my father was not personally saved by Raoul Wallenberg, although he was in the district in which Raoul Wallenberg was active, I grew up among other people who were saved by him. They spoke of Wallenberg with reverence, respect, and the deepest gratitude imaginable. When I came to the University of Michigan and began teaching a large lecture course on the Holocaust, I always devoted a special session to Wallenberg, taking students on a field trip to the memorial outside this very building and using it as an opportunity to talk about the values that Wallenberg embodied: empathy, tolerance, courage, and leadership. I felt it was important for my students to see potential in themselves by reflecting on how another student on this very campus went on to make a difference. And that Holocaust lecture course that I do, it's a whole semester, and there's a lot of people I talk about in that course who did really bad things. And it's nice to have one who really did good, who sacrificed himself for good, and who has a connection right here to the University of Michigan. We timed this event to honor both Wallenberg and the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., whose work continues around this nation today and whose memory we also observe this week. And I will point out that on Friday was actually Raoul Wallenberg Day in my native Canada. They have a day in honor of Wallenberg. And so as part of this conversation, we've gathered together 4 individuals who have tried to make a difference through education and activism. They come to us from different countries, different generations, and different perspectives, but all have given thought to the ways that individuals can change the world. And I would like to call them up to come onto the stage now. And maybe we'll have you all come up, and we'll sit over here. And as they're taking the stage, I'll let you know that some of you may have gotten those index cards when you came in, and if not, we can distribute some. If one wants to raise your hand, you can get them. And on those, you can write down questions, which we will collect and use to guide our discussion after we begin with a few comments of my own. After we begin with a few comments. So let me, as everyone's making their way to the stage and turning on their microphones, and I'll turn on my other microphone and move to my moderating chair. Now I feel like a moderator. Moderating chair. And I will introduce our panelists, beginning with Irene Butter to my right. Irene, yes. Irene was born, I'll introduce everybody and then I'll throw out some questions. So Irene was born into a Jewish family in Berlin in 1930. In 1937, 4 years into Nazi rule, she fled to Amsterdam with her immediate family, and in 1943, 3 years after the Netherlands fell to the Nazis, was deported to Westerbork transit camp and later to Bergen-Belsen. She managed to survive the camps and settled in New York in 1948. After earning a PhD in economics, she came to the University of Michigan as a professor of public health, where she became one of the founders of the Raoul Wallenberg Medal and Lecture here at the university. Since then, she has continued to educate and advocate for justice and righteousness. And it's an honor to have her joining us this afternoon. I'll introduce the others first, and then we'll go to remarks. Let's see, Christina Kim, sitting next to Irene, is a pre-dental international student dedicated to learning about and advancing social change, particularly in the areas of public health and social equity. As a former student leader in the Michigan Community Scholars Program and now a Newman Civic Fellow, she draws on her leadership experiences and commitment to social justice to create a meaningful and lasting impact. Next to her is Elliot Ratzman. Elliot is a fellow with us at the Raoul Wallenberg Institute and a scholar of modern religious ethics, thought, and politics. He's also an activist for racial and economic justice and peace in the Middle East, and he is finishing his first book entitled Zipporah's Knife, A Jewish Reckoning with Race, about ethics and anti-racism in the Middle East, the US, and Europe. And immediately to my right is my colleague in the history department here, Matthew Countryman. Matthew is an associate professor of Afro-American and African Studies, American Culture, and History at the University of Michigan, as well as the director of the OVPR Arts of Citizenship program. He writes and teaches on the history of protest and civil rights in America, and is the author of Up South, Civil Rights and Black Power in Philadelphia. And it's been wonderful having him as a colleague for the 12 years or so that I've been at the University of Michigan.
Oh, you're a newbie.
Yeah, he's been here a lot longer than that. But again, I won't say how long. But he even says words of wisdom in faculty meetings, which are not a fount of wisdom for anybody who's been in faculty meetings at any university. Anyway, I'd like to begin our conversation, finally begin our conversation, we've been here a while, by asking each of you to say a few words about the ways that you've tried to make a difference in your own lives through education and activism. And I think we'll begin with Irene, if that's okay.
I would say primarily I've given many talks over the last 40 years in schools, in churches, in libraries, museums, about the Holocaust primarily. And my favorite target audience are middle school students because they seem to embrace the subject and they're very open, and they ask very good questions.
Well, thank you. Christina?
I feel very pressured to go right after because, truth to be told, my civic engagement journey is a very, very recent one. And it started 2 years ago when I first came to the US as an international student. And my father, like Raoul Wallenberg, he is a diplomat. So I lived in various countries, but it was my first time coming to the US and experiencing a traditional, quote unquote, traditional American education system. And I joined the Michigan Community Scholars Program, whose director is actually here with us tonight, also known as MCSP, which is a living learning community dedicated to social justice, community service, and activism. I found that, I joined a dialogue led by MCSP, and I found that I was resonating with a lot of what my peers were saying, but I lacked a lot of the social, cultural, and historical knowledge to be able to participate in a both productive and sensitive manner. And so I decided that really educating myself was the best option. And so I eventually moved on to participating in a dialogue led by the IGR, Intergroup Relations program here in the University of Michigan. And I found that it was the most transformative and counter-hegemonic education I received because it equipped me with not only the tools to really question all of the previous education I've received so far, but it also equipped me with the tools to not just simply passively receive an education, to actively claim one. And that education truly provided the foundation for me to serve and represent the University of Michigan right now as a Newman Civic Fellow. And I am acting opportunities such as applying to grants and really trying to amplify the voices of the community to make a meaningful and lasting change.
Great, wonderful, thank you. And by the way, for the record, for those of you who are visitors to the University of Michigan, all of our students speak like that. Elliot?
Yeah, so one of the ways in which we who do not have a lot of resources, a lot of money, a lot of influence, the way in which we can make an impact, and I think this is true for many, but not all in the room, is that you have to have the skills necessary to know how to organize and be organized by movements already on the move. And so in my life, I've been involved with a variety of organizations as an organizer, as a foot soldier in the quest for justice, for peace. I've been involved with a number of things, both when I was living in Jerusalem, but also here. I like to think that I help out most being a strategist, a fundraiser. I did fundraising for Paul Farmer and Partners in Health for many years. And I like to think that by having one foot in the academy, one foot sort of in the world of organizing institutions and activist groups, that one can be a connector and one can help organize and strategize better with people learning and burning with the desire to do good in the world. We don't automatically have those skills, and so I like to think that as a trainer of activists and organizers, I've been able to sort of spread the wisdom into a variety of institutions.
Matthew?
So I come from a family of educators. My mother says that education is the family business. And also a family of activists, primarily in the civil rights movement of various sorts. And so for me, becoming an historian of African-American social and political movements was a melding of those family traditions and practices. And being at the University of Michigan has given me the opportunity as an historian and as a pedagogue to introduce students to a very different way of thinking about this iconic movement we call the civil rights movement, a way to push past the great man theories and mythological stories that are an important part of our civic education, but to think about them as, in the ways that Elliot just laid, as organic movements that have to be built, have to be sustained, that are full of internal disagreement and conflict, and strategic and tactical methods. It's a very different way for them to think about the movement, and it allows us to do what we are not always very good at as Americans, was just talking about race and ethnicity. And so it's what I do to try to help people think about what the American tradition and dangers are on these questions.
It's interesting as I hear you speak, and we'll get to this more, it's interesting that we're not actually used to, as academics, speaking about the role that our personal life plays in the scholarship that we do. And it just kind of occurred to me now, as I asked you all that question, to talk about the way your personal life plays. And of course, it does play a role in what we do. And I wonder, maybe we can get to this in a little bit later, but we could discuss the degree to which that should, and the degree to which we should be talking to our students about those aspects of our life. But maybe on that connection, I'll move on back to Irene and ask you a little bit about the role that you played in establishing the Wallenberg Medal and Endowment back when you established it, and what Raoul Wallenberg means to you personally, and why you've devoted so much of your time to this effort.
Sure. Well, I learned about Raoul Wallenberg in the 1980s at some point. Before that, I had never heard of him. And what I learned was that he was a Swede, that he's an alum of the University of Michigan, where he studied from 1931 to 1935. After his training, he had various posts, I think primarily in banks, and then at some point in 1944, he was sent to Budapest, to the Swedish embassy, to try to save as many Jews as possible, because Budapest by then was the only city that still had a substantial Jewish population. And he is said to have saved tens of thousands of Jews, largely by making out passports, but also he bought some property and called them safe houses and declared them Swedish so the Nazis couldn't enter, and that was another way of saving Jews. So when I heard about him, well, one reason this was very close to my own life is that my family was also saved by a consul from Ecuador who was stationed in Stockholm and provided passports to Jews, I think 100 passports that he issued. I don't know how many of those people were saved, but because of the Ecuadorian passports, my family and I were liberated from Bergen-Belsen concentration camps 3 months before the camp was actually liberated. And those 3 months would have been critical. And if it hadn't been for the work of this consul, I probably wouldn't be here today. So when we found out that Raoul Wallenberg was an alum and there wasn't any recognition or any notice of his having studied here on campus, we felt that he deserved better. And a small grassroots group was formed, starting to raise funds to create an endowment that would honor Raoul Wallenberg as he deserved. Now, it wasn't an easy road because fundraising is very competitive and there were barriers in our way, but to make a long story short, we launched the Raoul Wallenberg Medal and Lecture Series in 1990, and Elie Wiesel was the first medalist. And since then, well, this coming fall, we will have the 30th medalist sponsored by the Wallenberg Endowment. And I must say that I've met a large number of incredible human beings because of the Wallenberg project. And they have enriched my life, and it definitely has made a big difference. The focus on Wallenberg during the past 30 years has has made a difference in my life.
And now he's one of the most recognized and awarded people in the world, in fact, as honorary citizens of many countries. In fact, he's one of only 8 people in history who've been granted honorary United States citizenship. Again, right here, graduate here of Michigan. Matthew, let me turn to the other figure that we're talking about a little bit, Martin Luther King. And maybe if you can tell us a little bit about the ways that you think King made a difference. And the extent, when we were talking about this previously, you mentioned the phrase, did King make the movement or did the movement make King? Maybe if I can ask you to reflect on that a little bit and give your thoughts on the can one person make a difference theme.
Yes, happy to. Yeah, no, that's one of my favorite, and it's not mine, it's very eminent historian of the civil rights movement, Claiborne Carson's phrase. And a really important one for us for thinking about not only how the movement develops, but what the ways in which the recognition developed, obviously important recognition, the transformation of King from a social activist who was in many ways deeply unpopular for being a disruptor. And when Rosie and I were having this conversation yesterday, I started Googling this information on his favorability ratings in the mid-'60s. They were not electable. He was not electable at that time. But into an icon, right? Into a kind of honorary founder. And that's appropriate, right, in terms of the ways in which the civil rights movement remakes the nation, right? Is a kind of second reconstruction in terms of not only the legislative achievements, but also the cultural shifts that take place. And as a representative figure, it's appropriate. But it doesn't tell us very much about how that all came to be. In fact, I think it tells us some bad lessons about that. My mother, who was a civil rights activist, that's how my parents met, and who had the good fortune to actually meet Dr. King a couple times. She tells the story, or she talks about it as people think that somehow the civil rights movement was Martin and his 4 apostles riding into town, fixing everything, when it was quite the opposite, right? In fact, he stood at the front of a mass movement largely organized by working class women. A movement that was rooted in the community traditions and institutions of the South, of the Black South, of communities that had been disenfranchised for generations, that lacked political power, that existed in an environment where not only did the state not protect them, the state was a perpetuator of violence against them, and who, without political power, without the right to vote, without any rights, managed to make a revolution in nonviolent means. That really we should start from the premise they should not have been able to do this. All of our understandings of the way politics and power operates in our society, this should have been an impossibility. And I definitely fall on the side of the movement made Martin. And we can tell the specific stories about why he was picked to be the head of the Montgomery Improvement Association. Mostly he was picked by the older, more senior pastors and other black leaders in town, because if anybody was going to take the fall for the disaster that was coming, let's make the young guy do it. Now and they didn't. I mean, they knew he was talented. He was already a good preacher, but at the age of 27, 28. But nobody knew that he had the skill sets that he would emerge to have. And I'm not discounting his importance and his contributions, but it's all made possible because of the organizational structure that exists in that community and across the South. And in this way, the much more representative figure in my mind, and tell me when I go on too long, Jeff, is Rosa Parks. Not a middle-aged lady whose feet were tired, but rather an experienced community activist with 20 years of experience in that community, with a deep set of commitment to young people. She was the youth secretary for the NAACP, mentor to Claudette Colvin, who had been arrested months earlier for her role in the bus boycott, deeply outraged because another mentee of hers, Jeremiah Reeves, had been convicted of rape because in ways were clearly understood at the time, because of an affair that had gone wrong, or interracial affair that had gone wrong. Deeply pessimistic, in part in the aftermath of Emmett Till's murder, and telling folks, after 20 years, I look at the situation and I don't think anything will change. That's the framework in which she chose not to get up from her seat. That's the person the community rallied around to say, we'll build a movement around this. And her legacy of sacrifice, of doing what needed to be done, working as an unpaid fundraiser for the movement, losing her job, her husband loses his job, eventually they have to move out of Montgomery because it's not economically viable. They suffer through many years of real economic crisis in Detroit when they move here first. And eventually she gets a job actually with a new congressman, John Conyers, who many of you certainly will know about, that sort of saves their family. And then she just keeps going, right, for the rest of her life in those kinds of ways. Never asked to be in charge of anything, never seeks credit, is always about what she can contribute. Those are the kinds of figures, that's the representative figure. And what one person can do by contributing and being part of a mass movement.
That's great. Great answer. And actually, I have, maybe I'll go back to, I'm going to get to the two of you in a second. I want to go back to Irene for a minute, because I think the way what Matthew mentions about Rosa Parks, there is, of course, another woman who really made a difference in the Holocaust that I know intersected with your life, and that's Anne Frank. I'm wondering if you can just talk a little bit, tell the audience about your relationship, as little as it may have been, with Anne Frank and your interactions with her and what she has meant to you.
Yes, well, the Frank family left Germany around the same time my family left Germany, and we grew up in the same neighborhood in Amsterdam. Now, she and I didn't go to the same school, and we didn't really know each other, but I had a friend who was in the same class as Anne Frank, and a good friend of hers, and she would always tell me stories about her, particularly that she was very naughty in school. And she definitely was dominant in her school situation. And I think a lot of the girls admired her for that. So I knew a lot more from my friend, the stories of my friend, than personal knowledge. But so when I survived the Holocaust, and I spent a year in a refugee camp in Algiers, and my best friend from second grade, she wasn't Jewish, but she survived the war. She sent me Anne Frank's diary, the first edition. That was the first book I read after surviving the Holocaust. And, but that kind of skips the fact that I was one of the last people to meet Anne Frank in Bergen-Belsen at barbed wire. She and her sister Margot were in an adjoining camp, but we weren't allowed to speak or interact. But one evening, another friend organized this meeting. Everything was dark, so the Nazis couldn't see us. And at that point, she came to the fence, and she was very emaciated and very pale, and she didn't have any clothing. She just had a blanket wrapped around her. And so we asked what we could do, and she said, if you could get me some clothing. And so we went back to the barrack to gather some, whatever was left. They weren't clothing, they were really rags. But then the next day, my family and I left Bergen-Belsen on a train to Switzerland because we were supposed to be on a prisoner exchange. And so I didn't get to see her again, but I was probably one of the last people who saw her because she was so ill. Her sister was suffering from typhus, and she probably herself caught that, and I don't think they lived much longer.
Amazing story, and of course, those are people who certainly made a difference. And that gets us to, the kind of the question of the hour, the question that we phrased this whole event around, which is, can one person make a difference? And I'll rephrase it as, can one person make a difference, or does it take a village? The answer is obviously both to some extent, but maybe I'll ask Elliot to reflect on that question a little bit.
Sure. I want to argue very forcefully that deep and significant change can happen through small groups. We're always missing that. Either it's a massive social movement or it's some charismatic leader, which I have to ask you, think of all the great successful social movements in the last 20 years. Was there a charismatic leader in any of them? No. Environmental movement, gender issues, sexuality, even other sorts of movements. Very few have had charismatic leader. We can probably think of one charismatic leader this season. But I want to make the argument that actually it is small groups that make a difference. And I want to roll this back to what enabled Raoul Wallenberg to do what he did, and that was the creation of the War Refugee Board by the government at the end of the war. And why did that come about? Because of this spunky, scrappy, resourceless effort by just a few Jerusalemites who found themselves stuck in New York City in 1943.
Just to interrupt, the War Refugee Board, by the way, was an organization created by the American government in order to save European Jews. It was the only organization created by any government with the sole purpose of rescuing European Jews. And it was on behalf of the War Refugee Board that Wallenberg went to Budapest.
And that came about because of this small group that launched a pressure campaign against the Roosevelt administration, took out full-page ads in the New York Times, the first political group to do so, staged these huge pageants, influenced, got to Eleanor Roosevelt, went through all the cities, and over and against the Jewish establishment, which was slightly embarrassed by their efforts. So we have a small group who just through spunk and networking and the seat of their pants organized a whole advocacy group that led to the War Refugees Board. So where are we, I think we have to ask, where are we today in the face of suffering in the world? Which groups are we involved with? What small group efforts are we part of? How can we better equip ourselves to be better vessels for goodness and effectiveness to save lives? And I think that's the real lesson. It's not some magical charismatic leader as much as we love them, but rather the larger groups that support the movements. As Bayard Rustin said, you have to follow the movement that's on the move. And so where are we today, and what are we doing in the face of the enormity of suffering in the world on a variety of registers?
I'm going to actually, just to take that up, I'm going to say something in response, which at first I completely agree with you, of course. It is small groups, and those small groups need large groups. Just about Wallenberg. I mean, Wallenberg himself worked with, in addition to the War Refugee Board, he worked with a group of people in Budapest who helped him and who helped gather people to give passports. But he himself also, it also takes the certain type of person where he had the sense of privilege. He came from a very wealthy Swedish background, and he had the sense of privilege to just walk through Nazi lines and to save people and to go to the train stations where people were being deported and to hand out passports, to tell people. He would yell out common Jewish names and say, I'm looking for Cohen. And then just somebody would raise their hand and say, oh, that's me. And he'd say, okay, I've got you on my list. Come with me. And just take them. He had the sense to do whatever he could. He actually gave out the protective papers. To get a Swedish protective paper that you needed to be rescued, you had to write down the name of a relative you had in Sweden. And he would take that name, and the Nazis could presumably call up that so-called relative and ask, is this person your relative? He handed out phone books of Stockholm, asking people, and told people, just pick a name in that phone book. And they would pick a name in the phone book, they would write it down on a piece of paper, and occasionally the Nazis would call the person in Sweden. Some unsuspecting fellow in Sweden answers the phone, and they knew to play along and to say, yes, this is my relative. And that would allow people to be saved. So it's interesting that it takes, it takes some some flair in order to do it, some chutzpah to do it. But also, you need all of these other people at all these other stages to go along with it. Christina, let me build up on something that you commented about your father being a diplomat and asking you to also reflect on that issue. Can one person make a difference? Does it take a village? But particularly, in reference to your own experiences and having that sort of privilege, I presume, that he would have had in that respect, and maybe, have you reflect on that.
Absolutely. I mean, I think before I answer the question, actually, I think it's important to recognize that we live in a very complex and very divided time. And oftentimes it can feel like no matter how much we struggle and push, the world decides to push back 1,000 times harder. But as we've spoken today, optimism and despair can absolutely coexist. And I've also learned that part of how power is removed from people is by making us think that we don't have it. And part of stepping into and really reclaiming that power is by realizing that we have agency. And I've seen this through, the life of my own father. As a diplomat, you have to talk to people who have very different opinions, who are absolutely on a different political spectrum or whatever stance they hold. But I've seen that his embodiment of persevering through that difference and manage to work through that difference is so inspirational and truly portrays that one person absolutely can make a change, even if it's just, on a small relationship building scale. And, I heard that there's a class here today, actually, right after this event. And I think that's so inspirational because, education is obviously the important, transformative way we can make change. But I think it's also important to recognize that, yesterday might have been a very dark time for all of us, and perhaps the next 4 years might be. But what matters is that we're here today, and we are all gathered here today, because we are looking forward to the future and how we can contribute to it. So in fact, I like to be an optimist, and I like to believe that an individual can absolutely make a change. And it all starts in this room.
Wonderful. Very nicely spoken, yeah. I see Miriam is collecting questions, and if other people do have questions, this is a good time to put them on, and if she brings them down to me imminently, I'll be able to drop some of them to ask. But in the meantime, maybe I'll ask if there's other reflections on what anybody said, if anybody here wants to add to anything already. Yeah.
Well, I would like to talk about another person who, to my mind, made a great difference all by himself. And this is Günther Demnig. He's a German from Cologne. He was an artist until 1992, and then he started the movement of the Stolpersteine, which means stumbling stone in English. And what he does is he puts plaques, brass-covered stones that are engraved in front of the houses of Holocaust victims where they lived when they were first deported. And if we could have that slide. Yes, this is a stone dedicated to my father. And what it shows is the name, the date of birth, where he was deported to, where he died, and when he died. And now, or just recently, Günther Demnig placed his 100,000th stone in, I think, 26 countries all over Europe. And he's still doing this. He says he's going to do it until the day he dies. And his motto is that if the name of a person is preserved, that person will not be forgotten. And this is in response to the fact that the victims of the Holocaust were either cremated or gassed or shot and buried in mass graves. And so the descendants of that person, they have no place to go to like we do to cemeteries and to grave sites to visit our dear ones who have passed away. Now, he has done this single-handedly, and this is a picture of the stones of my grandparents placed in Berlin, and some of the neighbors I got to know of this site. They go periodically and clean the stones and put flowers there. And the next slide shows oh, well, this is another story. Another person who made a difference was a teacher in the town where my father was born. She was a history teacher, and she assigned to her students this project. They each could pick a name of a Jewish person in the town who was murdered during the Holocaust, and they were to do all the research to get the data that's necessary for Demnig to install the stone. And so this is the site of the teacher and the students in that class where they're placing these stolpersteine. So that's a very educational project for young students. And so the teacher is one person who made a difference in the lives of those students and other people. And the last slide, one more. This is Günther Demnig at the age of 77, and he's still installing the stones. And in this particular incident, he installed the 100,000th stone. And he's done this by himself, maybe with some help now that he's older. But I think it's a wonderful example of one person.
So just I'm going to get to the, yeah, I'll get to some of the audience questions, but I just want to say something on the Stolpersteins, that it's interesting because I've heard them used as another example of communities gathering together to install them. That once they're invented, now you have whole apartment blocks throughout Europe that want to install one recognizing the Jews who were deported from that building. So the whole apartment block gets together, they raise the money together in order to purchase the stone, they work together to upkeep it, and they put it there as a memorial. So that's one person, inspiring others to then work together to continue that mission. Now, of course, there's, I don't know how many, tens of thousands of them throughout Europe. You see them, anybody who's been to Central Europe or Central Europe in particular, Western Europe as well, knows about them from seeing them on the streets, and they're often put together by groups of people. Let me go to some of the questions in the 10 minutes or so we have remaining here before we wrap up. One of the questions that's been asked, to what degree do the leaders influence those who are not involved in the movement? What can they do to, how important is it to talk about the general public, to influence the general public, those who are kind of the unengaged movers, I'll call it. Anybody want to respond to that? Or think about that? Think aloud about that? I'll ask a few other ones and then you decide. Another one is, can social media play a role in change? Or is it time to get rid of social media? I certainly have an answer to that, but that's another question to think about. And also the way that social media has brought people together. I mean, social media, here's another example, right? Created by individuals. We know the names of those individuals who either created the platforms or subsequently purchased the platforms. And, thinking about, X in particular, right, which was a platform that had one goal, was then purchased, and then had another goal. And then there's this new platform, Blue Sky. I don't know if anybody knows Blue Sky, but which is not a private platform. It's a social media platform that is, doesn't have an algorithm, that it's all open source data, and so it doesn't have commercials and isn't having the same effect as the others. Maybe, I don't know, some questions to think about. Elliot?
There's a role to play for everybody, but the mechanisms of social change, especially around legislation and advocacy work and activism work, is not for everybody. I mean, not everyone's going to show up to a meeting. People are often difficult and annoying. Meetings are often long. You might have different sorts of talents, but I think it's behooving us to figure out where we fit in that story. I've been in meetings with big donors, with the senator, and I'm a penniless professor, and I get asked my opinion. So for those who are professors or professionals in the room, if you have not involved and put yourself at the disposal of social movements to meet with elected officials over important legislation around immigration or public health and other things, you need to do that because elected officials respect us, I hope, sometimes, about what we think. So I feel like there's a role for everyone to play, even if we don't have deep pockets, even if we can't stand being in long meetings with annoying people. And that's one way of onboarding it. We've also lost the act of interpersonal interaction. And so your average person who works all day and does not have energy to attend meetings and things like that, we have to figure out a way to onboard people into doing good work. Because everybody wants to do good in the world. Everybody wants to see suffering reduced. And there's distractions and speed bumps, but we have to figure out a way to work across ideological lines, across political lines, to reduce suffering and to see good in the world. That requires conversation, dialogue, but also action. And to figure out, to unlock that algorithm is, I think, the task of social movements moving forward in the next 4 years.
There's a bunch of questions. I mean, really, many of these questions have to do with the same issue, which is, the people that you're talking about who made a real change did so in the past, before the era of social media, before the era of technology. How do you get through the noise now, are the questions that are being asked. And I don't know if, do you want, Matthew?
Well, right, I'm an historian, so I'm talking about the past, but the question of relationship with technology as a tool for change is not a new question, right? I mean, there was a huge debate about, for example, around nonviolence and television. Right? And it was a very thoughtful use of television to try to use nonviolence to expose the violence of the racist South. And that there were people, one of whom ends up teaching at the University of Michigan much later, Robert Williams, who said, nonviolence is not going to work for me in my little town because there's no television. Nobody's coming to take pictures of us being, right? And so if I don't have a gun, I'm dead, right? And so there's that debate about nonviolence versus self-defense is about, in part, about technology, right? Social media is a powerful tool that people have used quite effectively for good and for ill, for good and for evil, perhaps. Figuring out, I don't think it's going to stop anybody, or if we presume that it can't be done because of this thing that's out there that's ruining everybody, on all our children and all of that, then that's true because we presumed it. But in fact, if we think about how do you navigate it as a context, then one hopes, and this is the whether it's as a social movement or a small group or an individual, people will be creative enough to figure out a way where there is no way to make useful of this tool, not to dismiss it, not to reject it, but to figure out how to make use of it. Certainly, compared to where we were 10 years ago, the thoughtfulness about what's dangerous is much, much more advanced, right? And I suspect we're past the point where people think if I post something, I've contributed. So now the question is where we go from here in that context. But of course, part of that is also how do we deal with disinformation and all of this, and how do we deal with a world, but again, it's not necessarily a new world. A world in which people believe things that aren't true or have been convinced of things that are not true. Well, guess what? That's always been true. It's always been a problem, right? I mean, the civil rights movement is dealing with the fact that there's a lot of people who think black people are incapable of democracy, right? They're going to ruin everything. And I'm going to stop here, but this is a different point. But I was reminded to think about Wallenberg as a Swede, of Gunnar Myrdal, who was also Swedish, who comes in a very important moment in the civil rights movement in the late 1930s, and is put in charge of a commission. He's a sociologist that's studying the race problem. And there have been a lot of commissions, and these commissions have all analyzed inequality, lack of education, all of the things, and focused on all of the problems of black people. And Myrdal said the problem is not black people. The problem is white thinking, the way whites perceive black people. And it changed the conversation about so many things when it came to race. The problem was not the presence of black people, it was the perception of the white majority towards black people. There's another example where, in a scholarly way, a new perception can drive these kinds of questions.
Let me turn to kind of the last question that I think sums up, where we're at, and that relates to a lot of what the other questions we're asking, which is simply, what do you say to young people? How do we help keep them? How do people help keep hope and motivation in today's America? I could say in today's world, but in general, what can we do? How can we use social movements, the power of individuals, the power of the group, to carry forward in today's world? Anybody want to take that up? Good question.
About young person, what do you have?
So I'll actually link this with the social media question because I was actually thinking about an answer. But I like to give myself credit for being the youngest on this panel. So I think I'm the most in touch with social media. But I do understand that with the rise of social media, we have seen a lot of platforming of very dangerous ideologies, and we see a lot of people resonating with it, and this leads off to a lot of echo chambers. But I like to also think that there are so many new social media accounts that are solely dedicated to raising awareness about these issues and shifting the public consciousness. And I'll actually portray an example because I found a nonprofit organization through social media called Project Smile Global. And it's through the Newman Civic Fellowship that I actually decided to work with the organization. And and I've applied and received grants for that organization. And so we really do see that social media does have a huge impact on being able to platform these organizations and bringing people together because they have similar passions. And, oftentimes we think of change as being on a huge global scale, but I think it's also important to realize that, change is also meaningful, even if it's on a personal or interpersonal level. And oftentimes change is most powerful when it comes from you. And so I think it's important to realize that, it's really easy to lose hope, but as long as you can change yourself, that'll create a ripple effect, and it'll create amplified and sustained change. But you have to keep yourself responsible, and you have to really ignite that initial spark so that you can create lasting change and beyond.
Fantastic. I am totally inspired and ready to go out there and make a difference. Other thoughts on that question? Or thoughts on other aspects? Maybe Irene, do you want to say anything about from your perspective, as maybe not the youngest on the panel?
I'll pass.
Okay. All right.
I'll say this. I think, again, after having taught here through many political twists and turns, this is not the first moment that has felt like there's lots of people feel overwhelmed and deeply concerned about whether or not anything can make a difference. I do think that historical awareness of communities that have survived through difficult times, particularly disparaged communities, is a crucial story to tell, that we need to tell about how we persevere through times of unfreedom. Sometimes people react as if telling those stories is about, producing guilt or a lack of faith in society. But I think it's actually the reverse, right? It's that story. Those are the stories that inspire the people to keep going, because it's not, history is not linear. Society is not a linear moving in one direction, right? It moves in many directions and it cycles in all different kinds of ways. And you have to be both prepared for those cycles, but also know that they are cycles, and that you keep working for the society that you want to envision.
I think we are all not ever doing enough. I think I draw this out of my own Jewish ethics, and I draw this out of the memory of the very young person being challenged about what were people doing during the Holocaust? Why were people not doing more to save those who were victimized by Nazism. And that has haunted me since I was in middle school when I first learned about that. I feel like I am never doing enough, and I look around and I see that there is so much energy and work that could be done. When we have meetings, they're not broken up by death squads like they were in Latin American countries during the 1980s. That we have access to incredible resources, that undergrads have access to free photocopies and computers and access to the intelligence and professionals of the world at their fingertips, and now with email and social media even more so, and yet we're not doing enough. And so I figure the challenge is to coordinate our time and our energy with others to be most effective, not just to know about things, but to actually figure out, and we know how to try to solve the problems of reducing suffering in the world. I think that's the challenge of our times. I think for America, for American democracy, I think it's the challenge of thinking about reaching across the aisle to these 7 million or so people who voted in a different way, and to not demonize them, but to see them as humans, as people who have an inner life and concerns and empathy and feelings about suffering, and to figure out where we agree and where we disagree, and to work together to make the world better. That is a challenge, I think, of American democracy right now. And the challenge of our world is that we know so much where there's suffering in the world, much more so than 150 years ago. And we have the ability to, through institutions, through advocacy, to do something about it, and we're all not doing enough. So I challenge you all, and I guess I'm recruiting here tonight for those to do more good in the world, to do it smarter and to do it with each other, because that is the way we're going to save ourselves.
And I'll just add on, one thing that I used to do with my Holocaust class, the very first day of class in September or August, whenever it was, I would show them some images or news items of whatever horrors were taking place elsewhere around the world, and say to them, this is happening right now. What are you doing to stop it? And the answer is nothing, and I say that it's not to make you feel guilty for not doing anything. It's to make you realize that you actually can't. There isn't all that much that you as individuals can do to fundamentally change things around the world. But what you can do, and from reading hundreds of records and listening to people talk about their experiences during the Holocaust and those who suffered unbearable things, that what they say they do remember is simple acts of kindness by other people around them. And those who lost their jobs, for instance, they were kicked out of their jobs because they're Jewish or whatever, their neighbors started to shun them. And people would look away when they walked by. And they all say, but what they remember is the person who didn't, the person who continued to look them in the eyes and who came out and shook their hands, or the classmate who continued to include them even after they were relegated to a group that was to be excluded. So, we may not and there are ways, I guess, that you can change the world, but it's hard. Not everybody is going to be a Raoul Wallenberg or a Martin Luther King Jr., both of whom, by the way, lost their lives for what they were doing, because of what they were doing. Not everybody can do that, but what you can do is simply give other people the benefit of the doubt and be kind to them and say nice things and recognize them. And that's something that I tell my students that they can do and that makes a difference. And I think that that's one way that one person can truly make a difference. So I think I'll thank our panelists on that note. Thank you, our panelists. And thank all of you for coming. I just want to point out, this is the first of these conversation series that we're going to be doing. You can see that the other ones maybe get into material that's a little bit more controversial and can one person make a difference. But we will be doing these other ones on February 18th. We'll be doing one on why is it so difficult to talk about the conflict in Israel and Palestine. March 11th, what are the driving forces behind hatred? And March 18th, what is genocide and should we name it? So those panels will be taking place over the following few months. Next year, we'll have another round of these discussions, and this is kind of the way that we're going to be, doing our events. So again, thank the panelists very much. Thank you all for coming, and thanks for being here.